Welcome back to Northwest City Politics in the Know with Juanita. We're glad to see you back with us again this week. We're glad that you're watching our show, and we're particularly glad that you are interested in the issues that happen in our cities. If you haven't watched our show before, each week we'll have somebody on from one of the 9 cities in Northwest Community Television's viewing area and be talking about the issues that are happening in that city, so you can kind of keep up to date on what's happening in your city or what's happening in the wider area. And then from time to time, we'll do some special shows like we are tonight. The legislative session got completed not so very long ago, and we're very lucky tonight to have with us Representative Lyndon Carlson.
Well, thank you.
From District 45A, right?
That's correct.
So we're glad to have you with us to kind of fill us in on what happened and how it affects people in our cities.
Well, I'm happy to do that, and maybe I'll footnote something when you say 45A.
Right.
The average citizen doesn't necessarily identify with legislative district
You're
numbers,
correct.
But they identify with communities.
Right.
And so the communities that I currently represent would be parts of Crystal, New Hope, and Plymouth. I don't have all of any one of those cities,
Right.
but I have parts of each, and probably about half of Crystal, I would say probably about 90% of New Hope, and then 3 precincts in Plymouth, which is a very large city of roughly 75,000, but I have about 10,000 constituents in Plymouth, even though I have just a small slice of it.
Right. And then you've had several town meetings over the past year. What were some of the topics, we won't go into them in depth, but some of the topics that came up from people at town meetings?
You know, the best way to answer that question is in a very general way.
Sure.
There's always a continuing theme. There's a high degree of interest in our area and truly probably across the entire state in education.
Right.
So anytime you have a town hall meeting, you're going to have a discussion of some aspect of education. That can be K-12, or this last legislative session there was an interest in early education as well. Almost every town hall meeting, something dealing with health and human services will come up. Transportation this last session, because that was a big topic before the legislature. I'll alert you to an issue in our general area, and that's metro mobility. We did have a person that came to one of our town hall meetings that's concerned about having better service with metro mobility. And then I also got an email from a different person, and both of them were dealing with physical disabilities.
Right.
And his concern was he's a great baseball fan, and Metro Mobility doesn't provide after certain hours service into New Hope.
Right.
And but they do into Crystal, and so there's just a short distance that creates a problem for him. And I think that part of the issue there is when the service stops, and you know, baseball game will often run until 9 or 10 or a little bit later, and so he has difficulty getting home.
Now, I thought we should spend a little time telling people about when you get to the point where a special session is needed, there's some rules and regulations and what has to happen, and so people saw some of what was happening, but maybe not all. First of all, maybe we'll start out, what's the governor's role? Because you get to the point where, the governor vetoed it, that's what he did, but what's his role after that?
Well, there's one person in the state of Minnesota that can call a special session, and that's the governor. So when he vetoes a bill, 2 things can happen. At one point, Governor Palente immediately called a special session when he was in the same situation, and that got long and drawn out because there was no prior agreement.
Right.
And the other approach that's been used by other governors, and Governor Dayton, is that you pre-negotiate the bills. And then the goal is to get the 4 legislative leaders to agree with the governor on a package that would be taken up, in this case, in a 1-day special session. And so That ultimately took, if I recall, about 3 weeks for those
Oh, right,
negotiations
yeah,
to
because people
take
would
place.
see little blips about it happening or on the news at night.
And the main negotiations on the Senate side, they basically said, well, we will be supportive of whatever Governor Dayton is able to work out with the Republican majority in the House. Now, it turned out there was some division on the environmental bill in both bodies, even with prior agreement. But at any rate, those negotiations took place, and so you saw the name of the Speaker of the House in the paper frequently, along with Governor Dayton, because they were the ones negotiating. So the rest of us were waiting for the outcome, but we did have an opportunity. I'm a part of leadership in the House with my role with Ways and Means, even as the ranking minority member. And so we would meet with and talk with the minority leader, who in turn was talking to the governor. So that was kind of the way some of us were having input through the minority leader. But the ones who were really at the table, so to speak, were the Republican leadership and the governor and his staff, and then we were providing input through our own mechanism, if you will, with the governor. And so in the end, they reached an agreement, but the one that ended up being a real tough sell was the ag environment. As I said earlier, not the ag part of it, but the environment. And the crucial thing there was we have, since 1967, had a citizens board, an advisory board with some powers to the Pollution Control Agency. And in the negotiations, that was eliminated, and in the environmental community, and for many of us in the legislature, myself included, I was very disappointed to see that board go. I think they really provided good public service for the citizens of the state of Minnesota. And some in the ag community, but not all, were concerned about, they had requested an environmental impact statement because a large entity wanted to put in a 9,000 head dairy farm, if you will. I don't know if you'd even call it a farm.
I don't know when it's that big,
but, that created a lot of opposition in the farm community. A lot of what I'll call kind of the family farms in the area were concerned about their water quality and what 9,000 head would mean in terms of their quality of life. And so some of those farm families, there was one woman in the particular that got a lot of coverage in the Tribune after the fact. She commuted almost daily, it seems like, or frequently at any rate, to St. Paul, farm woman, because she was very opposed to that. So then they asked for an environmental impact statement. So that got some upset. Some were happy that they were moving in that direction. But at any rate, unfortunately, the board was eliminated. And then there was also dealing with the regulations dealing with sulfur mining up in northeastern Minnesota. A good provision that ended up in the bill was what I talked about earlier, that I was temporarily at least chief author until another majority party member wanted to be chief author. And sometimes you have to be more concerned about outcome than whether you're the one that personally gets the credit, so to speak. And so we did get some buffer legislation in that, and Dayton was quite pleased with that outcome.
And there were just a lot of issues that they had to come to agreement on, which is why it took quite a while to decide when to set the special
Those
session.
are massive bills, and one of the issues, I was asked by a reporter, said, Lynn, you've been in the legislature a number of terms. Have you ever seen a session where there's so much policy put into the appropriations bills? And I said, I'd be pretty hard pressed to think of a comparable session where that happened. And so that's what triggered part of the breakdown, was that there was so much policy that normally would be passed as separate freestanding bills and have to stand or fail on their own. And In this case, they were put in major appropriations bills that have to pass.
Oh, right.
And so we didn't have anywhere near the policy bills that were passed on the House and Senate floor that you would have traditionally. The Senate tried to temper that a bit and initially said to try to keep the policy out of these appropriations bills. You always have some, because you need some policy to make appropriations work.
Right.
But there were issues that were just absolutely pure policy, no fiscal impact that was put in those bills. And that's what generated a lot of disagreement between the governor, the Senate, and the House.
And then what changes were made in the special session now? What changes were made in the K through 12 education bill?
The big one there, in conference committee, education funding had been greatly improved, especially over the original House position.
Right.
They were providing about a 0.6, or roughly just a little better than a 0.5% increase on the K-12 funding formula. So in negotiating with the Senate and the governor in particular, during conference committee time, they got it up to $400 million. The governor wanted a bill and ultimately prevailed. That would be his big win, along with the buffers in the special session. He did get $125 million more, bringing the increase to $525 million. Now, I'm throwing a lot of big numbers around, but you have to remember that's all the school districts across the state.
Everyone in the state.
What that boils down to is a 2% increase each year of the biennium. And we were hearing from school districts across the state that at those low numbers, that would generate teacher layoffs and larger class sizes. And with the 2 and 2, that won't happen. And the other issue was that the governor did get an increase in early education for preschoolers through expanded scholarships that can be used in both private and public schools. He did not get the centerpiece of what he had proposed originally, which was universal preschool for 4-year-olds that would have covered everybody across the state of Minnesota. And you might say, well, why is that important? There's a lot of publicity about getting children better prepared as they enter kindergarten. And we hear a lot about the achievement gap.
Right.
And a lot of people have said if you really want to address the achievement gap, early education is where the action is.
Right.
And I worked for many years on all-day kindergarten. Back about 20 years ago, I got the first 50 sites, 2 of them, by the way, in the Robbinsdale district, to provide for all-day kindergarten. And there were certain criteria that the school districts had to meet to be a part of that original group of 50, but the numbers drove how many there were, and that's what we were able to do. Well, finally, 20 years later, we got universal all-day kindergarten. Well, probably about a month ago now, there was a special on the news. St. Louis Park School District has to rewrite their first grade curriculum because those kindergartners being in there all day have achieved so much that now they just can't repeat what they were doing in first grade. Well, the argument for early ed is the same. If you get them better prepared when they enter school, they'll be more successful.
And maybe get rid of that achievement gap.
That's what we hope would be the outcome,
Now, was there anything not included in the education bill that you'd like to see put into it next year? Issues that you feel
I
about?
hope we revisit the early childhood. That would be an important one that I would like to see in the early ed through K-12. We have a tendency to say K-12, but these days it's really early ed through K-12. The other thing that I think that would be important when we talk education would be higher education. I would argue that the state universities and the University of Minnesota didn't come out as well as I would hope. And so I would hope that, and we do have revenue on the bottom line for next session, that we can revisit both of those bills. Early ed would be a priority for me personally, as well as the tuition issue. And by the way, I was reminded years ago, because we have a habit of talking about tuition, and one of the vice president for finance at the U said, Lynn, tuition is one thing, but you really should always talk about the cost of attendance, because it's tuition, room and board, books, other fees for labs and so on. So it's really the cost of attendance that's been skyrocketing.
Now, to take a little time to talk about two major areas that didn't make it through is that there was no tax or transportation bills passed, but how does that affect anything? Or they're different kinds of bills, right?
You know, every session we always have a tax bill, because there's always tax law changes. But that's not absolutely necessary. If you don't pass a tax bill, that's one area, unlike appropriations, where current law just continues on.
Right.
So there was major disagreement between the House, the Senate, and the governor on the tax bill. You may have seen some of the ads early on by some of the more conservative groups, give it all back.
Oh, right, right.
And so the House structured a tax bill that would have given basically about $2 billion, which was the surplus, in total back. Then any increase in any of the appropriations bills had to come from cutting other places.
Right.
And let me give you an example. Inflation running at roughly 1.8% would be probably about 700 million. So if you were just going to meet the increased costs, and we talked earlier about the need for school districts and so on, so when you gave it all back, you were going to underfund higher ed, K-12, and other state initiatives as well. And some of those bills were going through. A few of them did have some inflationary increase, some did not. A lot of that was taken care of in the conference committee, but they basically on taxes agreed to disagree and said no tax bill. The Democrats wanted to target, we're in agreement with some tax relief, but we wanted to target it to the middle income families.
Okay.
The other thing that the majority put through on the House was mainly commercial industrial tax relief. A lot of that, the lion's share of it, was going to places like Mall of America. Just a little reminder, I'm on the tax committee as well as Ways and Means, and it was pointed out that, gee, the owners live in Edmonton, Canada. Some of the downtown office buildings in Minneapolis were big winners, and some of them are owned by investors out of Dallas and Houston. Now they argued, well, that tax relief, they would reinvest that in Minnesota. You don't know.
No, you don't.
Mall of America people might have invested in Ottawa. Maybe they would have been Minneapolis or St. Paul. The Dallas folks might have invested in Atlanta or in their own hometown or wherever.
Right.
So there was a lot of money that was going to be flowing out of the state, and the overall cost of that into the future bienniums was about $5 billion.
Ooh.
The average citizen would have, with a let's say a mid-level income, would have gotten maybe about a one-time tax break of about $70.
Right, not very large.
If they had a child going to the University of Minnesota, they were going to pay more in tuition with it, and that $70 would have covered.
Now, is that basically a difference between the House and the Senate?
It was the governor and the Senate on those issues were fairly closely aligned. Minor differences, but they were pretty much on one page. It was really the major difference was the House majority and the Senate and the governor.
And now, what about the issue of transportation? Because everybody thought that was going to be the major issue, right?
When I was beginning the legislative session in January, I thought that transportation was going to be one of the very high priorities, maybe even number one, and that we would pass a transportation bill, but like taxes, that didn't happen in terms of an increase in funding. We did pass what we call a lights on bill, which kind of like taxes, except you have to appropriate it. $5 billion was appropriated, which is pretty much a flat increase or flat funding level for transportation. So there were a few things in the bonding bill. We mentioned one in Plymouth, with the bridge. So there were a few items in the bonding bill that dealt with transportation. But taxes and transportation hopefully will be taken up next March. The difference there was that the House wanted to use general fund dollars, and the Senate took, and the governor agreed, took a position of dedicated funds. And when you use, the argument against using general fund dollars is then you put transportation in competition with education, higher ed, health and human services. You've got one more big player wanting to have access to the general fund. And historically, Minnesota and most other states have preferred dedicated funds. The most recent dedication that we had was, and it did have an impact on the general fund, but license tabs. There was a constitutional amendment, and that was one way a few years ago that we increased funding for transportation. Didn't turn out to be as much as we thought, but the voters agreed that that should be dedicated. The gas tax that we all pay is a dedicated fund for transportation. So that was kind of the back and forth there. And then there was some disagreement as to how much was needed into the future for the next 10 years. The House majority said $5 billion. The Senate and the governor were saying, well, the studies that they had showed that in the next 10 years you needed about $9 billion. They did agree on a number.
Okay.
Guess what it was?
What?
What's the difference between 5 and 9?
Whatever.
Seven. So they did agree that probably for the next 10 years, $7 billion increase would be workable, but they didn't agree on where the money would come from.
Now, at the end of the time, in fact, it wasn't so very long ago, there was an editorial that talked about shift in fundings being kind of clouding the budget issues. Maybe you can explain, because the editorial was sort of clear but not. And maybe you can...
Well, to narrow it down, the biggest item I think was $430 million, if I roughly that number, that the House majority insisted be moved into expenditures for the current biennium, which, by the way, was controlled by the Democrats. So that makes the Democratic number look larger for the last biennium by the tune of like they spent more. So they moved it from the future biennium into the current biennium, and that reduced their, didn't reduce any programs, but it reduced their numbers so that they can say, well, they had one of the lowest increases in modern times in the state budget. But, you can play with numbers a lot of different ways.
Yeah, you can.
And actually, then if you were to talk about some of the other shifts that they had in the budget, that number grows to something like about $700 million. But the big shift was that one. And we campaigned, 2.5 years ago, when we recaptured the majority, about shifts and gimmicks, and that we made the commitment we wouldn't do that. We paid back the vast majority, the big one being the school age shift. We argued strongly for sound accounting principles, but that's what happened. I hope they explained it. Yeah, there was a good editorial on that.
No, I thought there was.
And it basically took the position that I'm talking about, that was really a shift that was unnecessary.
Right. And then something that happened at the end of the legislative session that didn't have anything to do with resolving it, but it's a local issue, is that Representative Ryan Winkler resigned. And maybe you can talk about what the wheres and whats and whys of it.
Yeah, Ryan, because that's a lot of interest locally. He represented about half the city of Golden Valley and a big part of St. Louis Park. I think Representative Winkler was in for about 10 years, if I recall, 8 or 10 years. And his wife had a tremendous opportunity, major promotion to basically be the chief legal counsel and basically, I think, head of the largest hotel chain in Europe.
Ooh, that's
And
pretty
there's
good.
a tie locally with the Carlson companies, and
Right.
I'm not sure just how all
Yeah.
that interacts there. As you know, they're in the hotel business
Right.
along with others. And but she would be working out of Brussels, Belgium.
Ah,
So he resigned his position in the legislature. They will be living in Belgium. Another footnote there is that his wife is originally from Sweden,
oh, okay.
and her parents live in Sweden.
Aha.
So another tempting part, I think, of accepting that very nice promotion was
Right.
that she would be a little closer to home.
Oh, definitely.
So I asked Ryan Winkler if they would be going to Sweden quite a bit, and he said, I have a feeling that her folks, the grandma and grandpa, will be spending quite a bit of time in Belgium too.
Right.
So he resigned his seat, and filings closed the other day, and only one candidate surfaced, Peggy Flanagan.
Yeah, that was a surprise.
And yeah, I was quite surprised, probably Peggy Flanagan as well.
Yeah.
And so she is almost elected.
Right. She should go in the voting booth.
The governor had ordered the special election to be held at the same time other elections are held
Oh, right,
locally this
right.
fall, which would have been in November. So she will be on the ballot in November unopposed.
Right.
So I think we can safely say, but you never want to count your chickens before they hatch,
Right.
that she's the next state
Right.
representative for that part of Golden Valley.
And that doesn't happen very often on a legislative basis, right?
No, it does happen once in a
Yeah.
while. The current Speaker of the House was unopposed. There was another Republican member that was unopposed the last election. Locally, I think you have to go back a few years, if I recall. One of the Brooklyn Center seats went unopposed, but it's pretty rare.
Right.
When you figure that House alone is 134 seats, 201 when
Right.
you count the Senate, the vast majority of those.
Right.
I've been elected 22 times, and
Yeah.
I've never went unopposed. So, you know, I have to say philosophically, voters should have a choice.
Right.
And that comes from my being a social studies
Right.
teacher, a government teacher. But if no one is willing to run,
Yeah.
and I have a pretty good understanding as to why probably
Right.
nobody surfaced
Right.
there, because from the Democratic perspective,
Uh-huh.
that has a very high
Oh,
Democratic
right,
index.
Right.
So it would be pretty much an uphill
Right.
battle. But having said that, you know, I've never complained about the fact that I've had an opponent each
No,
and every
no.
election. It keeps you on your toes.
Right. Well, I want to thank you so much.
Oh, you're
for
very welcome.
upgrading all of us on all the different ins and outs of what happened during the last legislative session. We really appreciate your being on our show and helping us understand. We're glad that you've been with us, and we'll look for you next week. Bye.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.